This is my sixth update as Dunleary Ratdown Musician in Residence. This week I'm going to talk a bit about traditional Irish music and how I adapted to the guitar and some of the guitarists and other musicians who've influenced me along the way. And then I'll follow that with an update on the composition that I've been writing for the residency. Turning it around this week, the last few weeks I've been starting with talking about the composition, but I thought this week I put it into context by talking about traditional music because there's a bit of a trad influence in the piece that I'm writing. So traditional music existed for years without guitar being used in it. It's only really in the 20th century that the guitar started being used with any regularity. The earliest recordings with a guitar that I know of are from the 1920s. Michael Coleman, the great fiddle player, had there was a couple of tracks with a guitarist on those tracks, and they're kind of, the backing accompaniment style was very simple. It was just like standard kind of chords in standard tuning, kind of. And a lot of guitar players, like mainly kind of folk singers who turn up at sessions and that, would still play like that and accompany in that kind of a quite simple way. But in the 60s and 70s, a few guitarists emerged who were a bit more kind of accomplished guitar players and brought in new ways of accompanying traditional music and then even playing the tunes on the guitar. The first guitarist who was really prominent at that was Artie McGlynn, great guitarist who passed away just last year. And he released the first ever album of traditional music played on solo guitar called McGlynn's Fancy. It's a great album, a really groundbreaking album of the time. And so he was using a slightly different tuning to standard. This is the standard tuning, E, A, D, G, B, E. But he mostly used this drop D tuning. So you're just dropping the low E string down to a D, and this is quite a common tuning in lots of music. Like there's some classical guitar pieces that use it. There's it's used in popular music and folk music, like Neil Young uses it in Harvest Moon. Paul McCartney used it with the Beatles, and so in traditional music it suits traditional music really well because of this drone. You've got two D notes and an A in between, and they kind of work a bit like the drones of the uilleann pipes, and which is really important in traditional music. And an awful lot of tunes in traditional music are rooted in D, and so having that resonance on the guitar really works well. So like I don't play like Artie, but some of his kind of style in accompaniment would be like kind of roughly like. It makes more sense when there's a tune going along to it, of course, but he sometimes did that. This is a very arty thing to do, that kind of art syncopation. And he was also a great tune player. And you'll see I'm using a plectrum here. I haven't used a plectrum at all in my other updates. It's mainly because I play fingerstyle most of the time myself. But when I'm playing traditional music, I'll often use a plectrum when I'm accompanying. And so I'm using quite a light pick for this, for that kind of accompanying. But when I'm playing tunes, I'll go for a harder pick because it helps get the notes out a bit better. So that tuning, drop D, also used by people like Steve Cooney and John Doyle. They're all. I have a playlist I shared last week, but all of this is relevant to that of guitar music from traditional guitarists, and you'll see here Steve Cooney and John Doyle and Archie McGlynn and everyone else I'm talking about on that. If you go to daveflynn.com and click on blog, you'll see the Celtic guitars playlists there. And so like Steve Cooney's way of playing, again, I don't imitate any of these players particularly, but say he does a lot of polkas and slides famously with Seamus Begley, and it's a very, very rough version of what he might do. He was kind of revolutionary in the way he brought in these kind of strumming patterns. That kind of feeling. And then John Doyle, say, he's most famous for working with Liz Carroll and the band Solace. I really like what he did with Liz Carroll, and I saw them playing once together in Donegal at the Frankie Kennedy Winter School, and it was fantastic. And so he would have here's an example of one of the pieces he did with Liz's tune, Lost in the Loop. It's kind of... kind of quite a funky rhythmic style, and he also did things like vaguely reminiscent of what he might do there. So that's drop D, and when I use drop D, I've used it a few times. I don't use it very often, but there's a couple of recordings on my album Driocht, where I'm playing with Kieran Swift and a couple of duets, and I do a finger style kind of accompaniment with drop D on the two tunes, the Monument and the Cricket's March Over the Salt Box. And here's a rough idea of what I do. And that's, I suppose it's almost harp-like, the kind of like a really low harp. And so that's that tuning. If you drop, there's a lot of alternative tunings in traditional music, a lot of individual styles. So I'll go through a few different tunings to talk about those and some of my own. If you tune the high E string down to a D, get a tuning they call double drop D, and I don't know anyone who actually uses this in traditional Irish music. It would be used by some folk guitarists in like English folk music, and also like 60s folk music and that kind of a thing. And it's quite a nice tuning because you have 3 D notes, which are like the equivalent to the drones of the pipes, the 3 Ds on the pipes, and you can just with some fingerings you might have learnt for like a D chord like that, or even a B minor chord, but and then a G and an A, those kind of fingerings, you can just lift up, don't fret the first string, only fret on these, the 4th, 3rd and 2nd string, and you get this kind of drony filled sound. So that's quite a nice, I don't really use it myself, but it's worth exploring. The next logical tuning after that is called Dadgad, and you just drop the B string down to an A, you've got that sound. This is a very common tuning used by a lot of guitarists in traditional Irish music and English folk music and Scottish traditional music as well. It kind of, I think it was in the 60s that it was kind of brought in by some English folk guitarists like David Graham, Bert Jansch and Martin Carty and that, and Jimmy Page used it with Led Zeppelin. That's where I first came across it, learning some Led Zeppelin tunes, and it's this is one of the pieces he did. Etc. etc. And so in Irish music, the two kind of pioneers of the dadgad style were Micheál O'Donnell from the Bothy Band and Scarra Bray and other groups like that, and Daithí Spruill, who also was in Scarra Bray, but is more famous for being a member of Alton. I don't really play dadgad myself. I don't. It's not a tune I really took to, but you know, in the hands of someone like Micheál or Daithí, it's a really nice tuning. Like here's a thing from the Bothy Band's The Maids of Mitchelstown. Etc. etc. And then like the chords, kind of there's a lot of power in these kind of chords, which would be like. So yeah, that's it. And Kieran Swift used the dadgad tuning when we recorded those. He was playing the tunes in dadgad, and we were influenced by a book by Sarah McQuaid called The Irish Dadgad Guitar Book, and it's well worth getting if you're interested in exploring that sound. But a tuning I use much more often is it similar enough to this, but you change a couple of the strings. You put the A back to a G, or sorry, a B, A back to a B, and then the A string here down to a G. So you've got D, G, D, G, B, D, D, G, D, G, B, D. And that's called open G, and so called because if you play the strings just with open strings, you get a G chord. And this was commonly used in a lot of blues music and particularly slide guitar playing, and Hawaiian slide guitar playing as well. And I don't have a slide with me, but I'll use the string winder as an example. Just kind of sound, which you've probably heard before. But again, the first time I heard this was Jimmy Page in Led Zeppelin, and a song of theirs called That's the Way, which goes like this. And I really like that open kind of resonant sound of the tuning. And then a few years later, I got an album, Andy Irvine and Paul Brady. I got it from my mum actually, because she was a big fan of Andy Irvine, but I think I listened to it more myself. And Paul Brady on that album really pioneered some guitar styles in traditional music, and he played some tunes, but he also, in some of the songs he sang, he used this open G tuning, like famously Arthur McBride. Yeah. And another beautiful one with the tuning he did was Mary and the Soldier. that's when I started learning them, I really got to like this tuning, and so I use it a lot. When I'm playing in a traditional music session, this is the tuning I'll use pretty much all the time. Sometimes I'll use a capo with it, depending on the key of the tune, because one of the reasons I like this tuning for traditional music is because, I said before there's a lot of tunes rooted in D, but there's also a lot of tunes rooted in G. So you have that kind of strong open sound with both those available to you, so you can switch between the two, say. And so I use that a lot on if you ever see me playing in a concert or in a session or hear some of my recordings, you'll hear that kind of a sound. I've also adapted it to playing a few tunes, like here's one of Paddy Fahey's reels. And so yeah, that's open G, lovely tuning. And then I suppose I started learning more about traditional music. I started learning lots of tunes on the mandolin, banjo, and then I started learning how to play the fiddle a bit. And those three instruments have the same tuning, so I'd learned loads of tunes in that fingering, and so then I'd come to play tunes on guitar and I'd have to totally change the fingering. So I decided I'd try and figure a way around that by seeing if I could get the guitar to be tuned a bit like those instruments. So my solution was to come up with my own kind of tuning. So from open G, what you do is you bring the B string back down to A, like in Dadgad, and then you bring the what you had as a D, you bring it up to an E again on the top string. So that's D, G, D, G, A, E. And what you got there is you've got G, D, and A and E are in that tuning, and they're the open strings of a fiddle or a banjo or a mandolin, so you can just adapt the same fingerings. You have to skip a string, but sometimes you've got this in the middle of the D and the A, you've got a G, and so I sometimes just use that for... if I was to be playing that on the fiddle, it would be like... So that's that tuning, and sometimes I would drop this low D down to a C, and that's for tunes that are in a C key or something like that. And say there's another tune by Paddy Fahey that I play that's like that. So that's some of my tuning secrets. But also, like, I'll go back to standard tuning because I use that every now and again. As I said earlier, like, standard tuning isn't really used very often except for by some folk singers or people who haven't really explored the open tuning systems and that. But one guitarist who's a bit of an exception to the rule in among the kind of professional level traditional musicians is Dennis Cahill. And Dennis uses standard tuning most of the time. He's famous for his work with Martin Hayes and also with the band The Gloaming. And here's an example of his style. He uses a plectrum, a hybrid technique where he holds a plectrum with the thumb and the first finger and then plucks with these two fingers. So that's kind of a very rough example of his style. I've worked with Dennis and Martin, composed a few pieces for them, so I came to that by just studying their music a bit. I was in master classes with both of them, and then eventually got to know them and proposed writing a piece of music for them, and it was called Music for the Departed. And when I was writing that, I was basically writing a guitar part for Dennis, so like there's a bit that it's kind of in the similar style that in the last part of Music for the Departed, it's like that's a bit about the tunings. I'll talk a bit about also playing tunes on the guitar. I mostly finger pick, as I said, but sometimes I use the plectrum, and some of the techniques that you use are like they're imitating fiddle or pipe ornaments or that kind of thing. So the first kind of common one is called a cut, and that's basically this sound. And what that is say if you play classical music, you'd be used to a term called a grace note, where you'd put your finger down fully and you'd do this kind of sound. But in traditional music, what you do is you don't put the finger down fully, you just kind of cut. It's notated very similarly in most publications. It looks exactly the same, but it's a different sound. And then the next step up from that is called a roll. And I never saw anyone try a roll on guitar before, so I started, when I was learning the fiddle and learning how to do a roll, I decided to try and have a go at imitating it on the guitar. So it's that's kind of the guitar version of a roll. And what it is, it's like a cut with a hammer-on followed by a hammer-on, what they call in guitar terms a hammer-on. So it's done really rapidly. It's quite a hard one to develop, but I kind of got there eventually. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it, like that's a kind of a sliding roll. It's imitating something some fiddle players do. And then the next one, the more complex ornament, is called a cran, and this comes from uilleann piping. And I first saw, in terms of pluck string instruments, Donald Lunny was the first person I saw doing something like this, and on a bouzouki, and I really liked it, so I tried to figure out what he was doing, and something like that. It's like a gurgling D note. If you slow it down, it's a similar principle to a cut. You're not fretting the notes properly, you're just cutting them. If you were to put the fingers down, it would be like And there's various different ways you can do it. You can double down on plucking it. So that's a few of the ornaments in traditional music that I use. There's also slides like and so that's a long way around of getting to the piece I'm composing. So I've shown you in the last few weeks that the rhythms and the bass lines, which are kind of, I suppose, more influenced a bit by jazz and rumba music and that kind of style. So above that, I've kind of finished this part of the piece. It's the second movement, which is kind of inspired by the Dunleary Dart line and just trains and that kind of a thing. But I have a few melodic bits now over the rhythms, and one of the melodic bits is influenced by a traditional ornament called a treble, which is similar to a roll but without the grace notes. So it's a that's the sound. And so here's a section of the piece. There's two different guitars we'll be playing in harmony using the treble ornament. And the other guitar goes. And I can kind of put the two of them together along with a bass line, a rough version of it. This is normally played by 3 different guitarists, so but this is a rough amalgamation, so you can hear the full sound. And then also in the piece, I'm doing another thing influenced by the treble. In the next kind of key change, there's things like this. It's a bit different to normal traditional music. It's not really traditional music at all that I'm doing here on this piece. I'm just kind of taking fragments, melodic fragments with the treble ornament in it, whereas like in traditional music you have a full long melody. In this I've more like got a fragment like that, and then other guitars are doing bits influenced by other guitar styles, like there's some influence from Congolese guitar styles, which I'm going to talk a bit about next week in the other guitars. So that's my update on the piece and on the just some info about traditional music and guitarists. I should also give a mention to Tony McManus, because a great Scottish guitar player who had a masterclass once years ago, and he was doing a thing, that treble, he was doing it with his fingers, almost like the way a classical guitarist does a tremolo. So he was So when I saw him doing that first, I saw it was just similar to the tremolo technique that I was learning, so I adapted that and I use it myself. So I'm going to end just by playing a tune back in my fiddle tuning. So I'll just play a reel in this tuning, and you'll see a bit of some of my techniques that I use if you look closely at the hands. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back next week with another update.